Hi guys, and welcome to History 240 again. So today, instead of talking about politics and the kind of major overarching pieces of Kentucky history, we're going to be talking about the start of the early 20th century, so going into the 1900s. And with this, we get to talk about some fun stuff instead of Reconstruction. Reconstruction is an area of history that I'm not particularly well versed, and so it's difficult for me to convey some of the historical and social conventions of that time period. Just from the fact that I'm a medievalist, it's complicated. It's incredibly complicated, and the politics involved in it are incredibly complicated and incredibly polarized. So today we get to step back from that a little bit and discuss some of the other things that are going on around the same time. Going into the early 20th century, a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today will kind of overlap the Reconstruction period. But for the most part, we're going to be transitioning over just a little bit and getting ready to start talking about how Kentucky really moves into the national sphere of politics and culture instead of being solely regional history. So the Goebel assassination, the Civil War, those will all play a part in globalizing Kentucky and really making it part of the larger national scene. But while we're doing this, I want you guys to understand that, based on what you saw with the Goebel assassination, you guys should be starting to see trends starting to emerge within Kentucky and basic stereotypes. See the development of these basic stereotypes in Kentucky. And you guys are going to see the development of some of these even more today. Sorry, I had to adjust the camera here just a little bit. And so, especially in regards to political division, in regards to violence within Kentucky, things like that. Issues with education are going to arise in the next couple of months, next couple of weeks, months, mercy. We're really going to see the development of these stereotypes. And so, going on from this, let's get started. So we're going to start out with the Hatfield and McCoy feud. And I'm just kind of going to push through this fairly quickly. I know a lot of you guys tend to really enjoy the discussion of the Hatfield and McCoy feud. And so with this, I put this in here just to give you guys an overview of the kind of violence that we're talking about in Kentucky in this time. And I would encourage you to go through and maybe look up some primary sources about these feuds if that's something that you're interested in. But for me, I find this to be a slightly complicated piece of history all on its own. And for some people, this is the most interesting portion of historical discussions. But for me, we're just going to kind of push through this real quick and see how this develops into some of the stereotypes that come along with Kentucky being particularly violent. So this incident, or a series of incidents, involves two families who are on the West Virginia and Kentucky border along the Big Sandy River. Both families had members of them that supported the Confederacy. Only one, whose name is, and you guys will have to forgive me, I am terrible with these names, so they're probably going to get butchered. But anyways, only one member of the McCoy family, whose name was Asa Harmon McCoy, fought for the Union. So when Asa comes home, he has recovered from a chest wound that he got fighting in the Civil War. He finally gets to come home. And he's killed on his way back home by a group called the Logan Wildcats. And this is likely led by a fella named Jim Vance, who is the uncle of William Anderson Hatfield, who's also known as Devil Anse. And this happens on January 7th, 1865. The Civil War has just ended, but we're still seeing the repercussions of this. And this is only 13 days after his final day of service. So he survived the Civil War, which a huge portion of Americans who fought in didn't make it out of. It's one of the bloodiest wars in American history. There are more people who die in the Civil War than there are between the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War put together. So this is an incredibly bloody war, and this poor fella ends up dying 13 days after he ends his service. But the local sheriff attempts to kind of mitigate violence at this point, but isn't particularly able to, and it really spirals out of control from here. And this is where many historians believe the start of the feud is. So a couple years pass. There are some legal disputes, and one of them involves a hog, and this hog supposedly is owned by either Floyd Hatfield or Randolph McCoy. And they base this off of notches in the pig's ear. So it's kind of like cattle branding, where you have a specific mark that is your mark that says that you own this piece of property, and specifically cattle, pig, livestock, that kind of stuff. And so they will have a particular notching in the pig's ear. And the legal dispute happens in 1878. So the Justice of the Peace, who is known as Anderson Preacher Ants Hatfield, declares the hog to belong to the Hatfields. Of course, that's his family. But this is based on the testimony of a mutual family member between the Hatfields and McCoys named Bill Stanton. And later on down the road, he'll be killed by two McCoy brothers. So following this, there is a love affair between Rosanna McCoy and Johnson, whose name is Johnsy, or he's called Johnsy Hatfield, who is Devil Anse's son. And she left the McCoys, but had to return later. She attempts to resume her relationship with Johnsy, but Johnsy isn't particularly interested in that, and he's arrested by the McCoys on bootlegging warrants. And so Devil Anse mounts a posse and says, "Let's go after him, boys. We're going to get him back." And he keeps them from reaching Kentucky at this point. They're trying to transport him to Pikeville, which is where the local justice has all of these warrants. But despite the fact that Rosanna goes and tells Devil Anse about the fact that he's been arrested, these kinds of things, and trying to win him back, he leaves her while she's pregnant for her cousin, who is Nancy McCoy, who he married in 1881. So the next year, you have Ellison Hatfield, who's Devil Anse's brother, and he's killed by Rosanna's younger brothers. And this is in retaliation for Devil Anse's son leaving Rosanna McCoy while she's pregnant. And the brothers' names are Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud. And they fought with Ellison, who was drunk at the time, and Devil Anse on Election Day. And what happens is that Ellison Hatfield somehow winds up dead. We have no idea how he ends up dead. No, we didn't do it, despite the fact that they stabbed him 26 times and they shot him once. So they're arrested and in transit to Pikeville by the Hatfields. They're intercepted by Devil Anse and taken to West Virginia, where and at this time, Ellison, despite the fact that he's been stabbed 26 times and shot once, he lives through this. but he dies from his wounds. And when these boys are taken, Devil Anse and his family members will tie them to a group of pawpaw bushes, pawpaw trees, whatever you want to call them, and they fire 50 shots between the two of them, and kill them, of course. They don't end up surviving that one. But all those who were involved in the killing are indicted, but many of them aren't captured. So with the help of Perry Klein, who ended up losing a large lawsuit of about 1,000 acres or so to Devil Anse, and he's married to Martha McCoy, a McCoy, he sends out a reward for their arrest. So in 1886, you have Jeff McCoy, who is a murderer, and he kills Fred Wolford. So the constable, who is Cap Hatfield, went to capture him, and he and Wallace are shot, and they shot shoot Jeff McCoy on the Tug River, but Wallace is not found dead until spring of '87. And so you can see this kind of back and forth, tit for tat kind of mentality that's going on in these feuding families. But it really comes to a head in 1888. And what they call this, it happens on New Year's Eve, New Year's night, January 1st. And they'll call this the New Year's Night Massacre. So Cap Hatfield and Jim Vance are surrounded, and they open fire on and burn down the home of the McCoys in an attempt to capture Randolph McCoy while his family's sleeping. So Randolph escapes from the fire, escapes being shot, escapes being surrounded, and they do this in an attempt to get back at the McCoys for a bunch of killings up to this point, and they're just kind of sick of it. But two of his children are shot, and his wife is beaten, and the other children get away, but they get frostbite. And so if you've ever had frostbite, or if you've ever heard of anything about frostbite, you know that it's particularly bad for young children. And these children, they're sleeping, they're in their pajamas, they don't have time to get shoes. It's January. These kids get frostbite. They're up in the mountains. And so because of this, they move to Pikeville. And then from there, you have Frank Phillips, who is the county deputy sheriff, who rides out to catch Devil Anse and his group in West Virginia, where Jim Vance is killed because he refuses to be arrested for this New Year's Night Massacre. And so they raid the Hatfield homes, and they capture 3 of them in what's known as the Battle of Grapevine Creek on January 19th of '88. And this is where Phillips met with an armed group and a battle ensued. So there are 2 Hatfield supporters who are killed, and Deputy Bill Dempsey, who is executed by Phillips after the surrender. It doesn't necessarily, I've not found anything so far that necessarily says why Bill Dempsey was executed. It just simply says that he's executed. So if you guys happen to find that in your primary source document analyses, I'd love to see that. But following that, you have Valentine Wall Hatfield and 8 others who are brought to Kentucky to stand trial for Alifair McCoy, who's Randolph's daughter, who is killed at the New Year's Night Massacre. So 7 of them received life imprisonment, and 1, who is known as Ellison Cottontop Mounts, is hanged. And later, John Z. Hatfield is tried in 1901 and hanged. But this isn't even the most bloody feud. And this is really what I want you guys to take away from this. There's a whole lot of information based on the Hatfield and McCoy feuds, but that's because we have a lot of information on it. A good portion of the Hatfield-McCoy feud takes place in court, not necessarily in the tit for tat, back and forth. I'm going to kill you, so I'm going to kill your brother. I'm going to kill your uncle. I'm going to kill your cousin over here. You know, most of it takes place in court. This is not even close to the most bloody feud that happens in Appalachia. Many consider the Breathitt County feud to be far more violent, but the Hatfield-McCoy feud is highly publicized. It's known on a national scale, and because of this leads to stereotypes about the feud and about Kentucky based on the feud, and people who live in the mountains. It also affects West Virginia in the same way. But you really see Kentucky coming to a national level, and at the same time, they're getting a bad reputation on the national level because of these feuds and because of increases in technology and increases in the way information is processed and the way that information is transmitted. You know, people talk about today the problem with the media over analyzing and you know, over publicizing violence. This is one case where the media actually did, and it led to serious repercussions in Kentucky and the development of stereotypes of Kentucky being a terribly violent place. But, you know, at this time, we do see an increase in violence overall in Kentucky, but we see an increase in violence everywhere. It's not just in Kentucky. It's just a particularly violent time in United States history. We have just seen the end of a civil war. There are still political factions associated with the Civil War and groups who are still affiliated with the mentalities of the Civil War. That war doesn't end with Grant and Lee saying, okay, we're going to end this here. That's not the kind of mentality. There's not a peaceful reunion based on the ending of the Civil War. So, knowing that, we're going to move on to economics. I know that's a lot. Don't worry too bad. We'll be okay. We're going to get into fun stuff soon. So basic economics about Kentucky. Like I said, Kentucky is going on to be in a national scale. So some of the things that are happening on the national scale will affect Kentucky and vice versa. So you've got to know a little about general American politics at this time. So, number one, this time, the period between around 1870, which is considered approximately the age of Reconstruction, to 1900, beginning of the 20th century. This is called the Gilded Age. And this term comes from Mark Twain's novel, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. The majority of this time is marked by rapid economic growth with intermediate panics. And by panics, I mean that there are huge bounds of economic growth and then they plummet. So if you guys think about the kinds of things that happened in the Great Depression, that's the same thing that's happening here, only on a smaller scale. And these intermittent panics are happening every so often. A lot of them are associated with bad business policies. So there's one in 1873 and another one in 1893. And the one in 1893 is directly related to Argentina and the fact that Argentine banks are failing. There was a wheat crop failure, and there was a coup, which overthrew the government. So the U.S. banks are run by foreign investors. They are putting money into these foreign landscapes and getting money back from these foreign landscapes. And so when we see the economic downturn in Argentina, we see a sharp decline in our own economy. And the same thing happens in 1873, only the circumstances surrounding it are a little different. So, also during this time, it's marked by general wage increases for skilled workers, and there's also an influx of immigrants. You see vast industrialization, railroad, mining, factory systems, increases in financial awareness, increased use of labor unions. All of the things that are associated with industrialization happened during this time period. And we're going to go a little bit more into that on the next slide. There's also a high concentration of wealth, but increased poverty. There's a polarization of wealth. So there are a group of extremely wealthy people, you know, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, all of those guys. And then in the immigrant section, you have extreme poverty. Mostly you'll see this in urban centers, but some of these things do come into Kentucky. With the Panic of 1873, this is a financial crisis that leads to a little mini depression from about 73 to 79. It has a couple of very key causes. And one of the main causes is that the United States was kind of on this economic roller coaster at the time. So you've got the U.S. government that's funneling money into the Civil War. They're funneling money, and they're funneling money, and they're funneling money, and there's this huge rise in the cost of basic goods from the Civil War and trying to fund the Civil War. Well, when the Civil War ends, those price increases collapse. And so you'll see that there was just this huge, big bunch of inflation that was just kind of hanging around. And they were artificially increasing prices in order to have more money. We'll also see that it's caused by speculative investments. This is mostly done by the railroad. And what we mean by speculative investments is that you'll have people who are buying stocks in railroads, specifically railroads in this case. And it turns out those railroads and their stocks aren't worth the prices that they're selling them for. They're thinking we can buy them really low, and then we'll sell them off later really high, and we'll make a profit of them. Well, even though those investments, you know, they think they're going to rise, they don't ever rise, and they just end up crashing in 1873. And so with that, you've also got the problem of silver being demonetized in America. And this is sparked by gold rushes in 1840 and 1910, and then in Germany, they will demonetize silver altogether. And this happens with the Coinage Act of 1873. So you can see there's a direct correlation between silver being taken out of the economy and put in for gold, and the Coinage Act of 1873 and the financial crisis that happens. So they're taking all of this wealth out of the economy, and it just falls apart. There's a trade deficit. During the Civil War, you know, we had been buying and buying and buying and buying to try to fund this war. Now we have the issue of we can't sell out from here. We were bringing in goods, but cotton in the South can't make it to other ports, can't make it out of the country, because other countries that had normally bought cotton are using cotton from other places. In Britain especially, Great Britain, you'll see them move the cotton industry to Egypt and to India. This becomes a major problem for the South. And this will most heavily affect the South. There's economic dislocation from the Franco-Prussian War. So you wouldn't think that a war between France and Prussia would really have that big of an impact on the United States. But because we're funneling money into these areas, the fact that the war will end and that there will be issues in Europe based on this one war will cause financial depression in our own country. There are huge losses in property in Chicago and Boston because of fires. So, the amounts that people are putting in to try to compensate people in these areas that are having major issues from fire, especially insurance companies. Insurance companies can't keep up with this kind of demand. We'll see bank reserve strain and bank failures. The stock market will crash, especially in Vienna. And there's this, what we call, bubble of false expansion, insolvencies, manipulations of the market, which we'll see happen in the United States prior to the Depression. And this will lead to bank failures. And these bank failures are normally what we end up calling bank panics. And if you look over to your pictures and you look at the bottom left-hand picture, that's the front of a bank in an urban area. The bank has a group of investment pieces. And what they'll do is they'll take a limited amount of cash, they'll take a limited amount of gold, and they'll invest in them in things like railroads and other stocks. They'll take your money and they'll do something with it. They don't hold on to your money. And so when people come to collect their money that they've put in the bank because they see the bank is secure, too many people come. There's not enough money to give every single person all their money or all their gold. So the bank has to close because it's completely devoid of money. So with this, we'll see masses of bank closures and masses of people who lose their entire life savings because they put all of their money in the bank, which the bank closed, so now they can't have access to any of their money. And it's like, too bad, so sad. Sorry about your luck. We can't help you. And we'll see a change in this as we go over into the Depression. But for this period of time, for the Gilded Age, you guys can kind of see it really is kind of gilded. It looks good on the surface because we have these huge economic gains and modernization and increases in art and literature and culture. But on the inside, it's kind of imploding. It's really ugly. You've got these workers who can't get jobs and they're extremely poor, and property loss from fires, and people who lose their entire life savings. So you can kind of see where this term Gilded Age comes from. Now, with that, and understanding the economic and social issues of this time, we can go on to try to talk about some of the industrial advances, I guess you would call them, that really spark some of these economic issues and political issues that we'll see going in from here. We'll see literature and art increase in abundance, and many of the things that we'll see will be based on what people experience based on these social and economic ties. Okay? So let's go on to the Industrial Revolution. Now, we saw that with speculation, and specifically in railroads, we'll see direct causes of the panic and the depressions of the 1870s. Within the Industrial Revolution, you'll see increases in productivity. We'll see new technologies developed that will make the process of working and getting a product easier. And because it's easier, people will be laid off. And this will lead to increased unemployment. Increased unemployment will lead to less spending. Less spending will cause a decline in the economy. A decline in the economy can kind of steamroll into a panic. So is this kind of making sense to you guys? So this will mainly happen with railroads, but we're going to see other things as well. So in steel and petroleum production, you have the petroleum industry that starts in Scotland, but it's brought to America by Edwin Drake in 1859. And this will lead to kerosene production and gasoline, which is a completely unwanted byproduct, until cars are invented. So when cars are invented, gasoline becomes one of those products that people are trying their hardest to get. With steel, there's a development in the Bessemer process, which is invented to reduce impurities in pig iron by oxidation. So if you guys have ever seen Forged in Fire, for example, you'll see bellows blowing over pieces of iron, and you'll see as iron cools, when they're beating these pieces of metal with their hammer, you'll see little flakes coming off, and that's pig iron being oxidized and turning into steel. And essentially what they're doing is they're just blowing air over it, and this gets rid of a ton of impurities within pig iron. And so this will increase the scale and the rate of production in steel. When steel is easier to get and easier to make, and it's harder than just standard iron, you don't have to replace it as often. And when you don't have to replace it as often, it makes your railroads cheaper. And when your railroads and railroad ties are cheaper, you don't have to replace them as often. So you're losing workers based on repairing railroad ties. From one thing that I've read, in a standard railroad yard, in a year, before the Bessemer process comes to the United States, you'll see the replacement of over 720 railroad ties in a year, just in the railroad yard. Once we enter into this Bessemer process, they'll cut it down to one a year, one railroad tie a year. That's super simple for them to have to change out. It's cheaper. And so they can cut their spending on all of these people who are supposedly working in these railroads. And so unemployment. And so you'll see a drop in the economy. It all kind of steamrollers. So we'll see railroads going over to steel because of their increased durability. We'll also see railroad engines that are more powerful, which will lead to cheaper shipping, which you'd think would be really great for the economy. But it turns out it's not, because you've not got people who are fixing these old engines. You've not got people who are managing the railroad yard, the railroad ties. You've not got any of that along the tracks. And so you're thinking, oh yeah, cheaper shipping, that'd be great, until you realize that your aunt, your uncle, and your 3 cousins have all lost their job at the railroad centers, and so therefore can't buy anything in order to get cheaper shipping. It's one of those unfortunate things that happen during this time. You'll see the first bicycles coming into America, and you'll see a bicycle boom in 1890 and in the 1890s. This is where the first modern roads really come into being. You won't see roads come into being because of automobiles. You'll see them because of bicycles. And if you've ever seen an old-time bicycle, oh, they're awful. They're these giant wheeled monsters with a little teeny tiny wheel on the back. And you'll pedal that big wheel in the front. And with that big wheel, you really don't want to fall off of that when you're going down the road. So if you got a big pothole in the middle of the road, you can't ride your bicycle down the middle of the road. And so this is why we'll see the advent of the first roads. Automobiles will come into playing from about the late 1890s on. The first inventor is Carl Benz of the automobile. Henry Ford is not the inventor of the automobile, but he makes them cheap, and that's why he's famous. So he'll build his first car in 1896, which will cause him to create an assembly line to help keep costs low. So a person who screws in the same screw every single day and puts together the same two pieces every day, all day long, they get really fast at putting those pieces together and screwing those screws in. So this will make the process go faster. And not only will it make the process go faster, it'll keep the cost lower, because you've not got one guy creating one product and you have all of these people who are demanding it. No, you can make 20 cars in a day. That's an exaggeration, but you can make a lot of cars that way. Radios and telephones will come into use. So wireless transmission. Most people think, oh, wireless transmission, that's been in the last couple of years. Wi-Fi is great. No, this happens in 1897. So you'll see wireless radio transmissions invented by a fella whose name I can't say, but I could say his last name. It's Marconi in 1897. And he will develop something that is more efficient than the telegraph. And so there won't be any kind of underwater wire lines. There won't be underground wire lines. That you won't see as many going through and down the roads, things like that. You won't see any of that because you have wireless radio transmissions. Telephone will be developed by Alexander Graham Bell. And the reason he did this, he wanted to do this to increase the speed of business transactions. If you've got somebody who's doing Morse code all the way across the country versus a telephone, which is where you can just hear somebody talking and say, hey, I need 30 of these. That's much faster than beep, 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 having a series of beeps to dictate one sentence. And with this, you'll see wire connections for things like telegraphs just going by the wayside. So you'll really see an increase in production in this time. Now, moving on to literature. We're only going to talk about a few guys in literature, and these are the ones who are most relevant to this time period in Kentucky. So you've got Walt Whitman, who's known as the Bard of Democracy. He's born in 1819 and he dies in 1892 in West Hills, New York, but he's born in Kentucky. He's a poet, an essayist, a Civil War nurse, a journalist, and he's most famous for his work called Leaves of Grass, which he'll just continue adding stuff to until he dies. He's got one work and he just revises it and adds stuff to it the entire time. And it's an epic poem in the first person about the average person in America. And that's why it's so incredibly popular. And then you've got Mark Twain, whose real name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens. He lives from about 1835 to 1910. He's a writer, a humorist, an entrepreneur, a publisher, a miner, a riverboat captain, a lecturer. So he's got this very wide array of all of these guys have a very wide array of experiences that they can draw off of. And he's most famous for The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He creates a publishing company called Charles C. Webster and Company, and he'll create it with Charles C. Webster. And because of this, he will have unlimited printing for his books. And that may be part of the reason why he's so popular, is because he writes his own books, he's got his own publishing company, and he can publish his own books from there. From there, you'll see differences in arts. So you'll see a movement from kind of super clouded images, images that aren't very realistic. They don't have any kind of defined images towards realism. And if you look at the picture at the top, This is called Impressionism. And the one at the bottom left, this is called Impressionism. You can't really see the faces of the people who are baling hay. You can't really see the faces of the children. You can tell they're children, you can tell they're playing, you can tell they're there, but you really can't see anything distinct about them. And so we'll see a movement away from that. One of the most famous impressionists for Kentucky will be a fellow named Winslow Holm. And he really wants to capture that nostalgic America, the pre-Civil War nostalgia of how good it was in the good old days, and the simplicity of the country. But we'll see a movement away from this into what's known as realism. And Thomas Eakins is the best known for being the first realist. And if you look in the bottom right, this is what we're talking about. You can see details on every single part of this person. You can see the details on the man who is teaching the class about operating on an individual. You can see the widow weeping. You can see the leg of the man who's being operated on, and obviously he's dead or they wouldn't be doing this kind of stuff in the classroom with him. But you can see the junior doctors who are studying this, and you can tell that this guy's a lecturer and he's in a lecture hall. You can see all of that, and you can see highly defined features. You can see down to the individual knuckles of the woman who's holding her hands up like this, sobbing because they're taking apart, literally taking apart her husband on the table. Now, moving on from art, and this is probably my favorite part about this section, is popular culture, because it's so vast. A lot of the things that we think of when we think of the Old South and moving into the new America comes during this time period. You'll see the emergence of vaudeville, which is performances made up of separate acts of entertainment. There'll be jugglers, there'll be acrobats, there's a giant elephant doing a show. They're very circus-like. And they'll tour through towns. There'll be comedians, there'll be trained animals, one-act plays, and they're just kind of squashed together. And it's called vaudeville, and it's incredibly popular. And it's one of these times when we still have the leisure for entertainment. We have the time to go to entertainments, and we're paying, most importantly, for entertainment instead of just working all the time. So you'll see a movement away from a constant state of needing to work and needing to make money into having leisure and the importance of leisure. In regards to clothes, you'll see a fairly elaborate change for both men and women. The first blazers for men are created in the 1890s. So, fellas, for those of you who don't like to wear dress suits, you can thank the men in the 1890s for that. You'll see the beginnings of short hair with a lot of facial hair. But this will start going out of fashion in the late 19th century. You'll see the emergence of top hats and the popularity of top hats. And yeah, you'll see this kind of stuff with Abraham Lincoln and, and those kinds of iconic figures who wear the top hats. But the top hats will really come into popular culture during this time period. Women, their clothes, the way their clothes are made, what they're using to make their clothes will just astound you for this time. For those of you who don't know much about textiles, up to this point, homespun, which is cotton or flax or any kind of spinnable and weavable material, will be made into clothes, and they'll make those at home. At this point in time, we start seeing the emergence of machine-made quality goods. And not only will they be machine-made, but you'll see a movement away from home-dyed clothes to clothes that are dyed by machine and by chemicals. So for those of you guys who don't know, this is really cool. There is no way to make a natural green. And I know you're going to think to yourself, now wait a second. I see green all the time in all those old medieval pictures, and I see green all the time in movies about older times. Green didn't exist in natural form. You can only do that with chemicals. And so you'll see these really vibrant colors starting to come around in this time period, because chemical dyes are becoming a thing. Madame Curie and chemicals and chemistry coming together to create dyes. This is where you really see it coming to a head. And so you'll see colors like mauves, greens, puce, like these absolutely hideous colors. But they're really popular because nobody can get those with natural dyes. And they're available to those who don't have a lot of money. Now, along with this, you'll see extremely elaborate hats. And this will nearly push the birds along the shores, especially in Florida and in the Everglades, near the brink of extinction. So someone once estimated that 95% of shorebirds will be killed for their plumes, just for feathers to put into hats. And you can kind of see these in the pictures that we've got on here. Dresses and skirts. You will see bells getting smaller and smaller and smaller in women's skirts. So if you guys remember, think Scarlett O'Hara. Think giant cages for clothes. And you'll see that kind of blooming figure at the bottom become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And then you'll see the tops, which go from very slender, very kind of pointing downward, invert, and you'll see these giant puffy sleeves or these giant hats that are decked out to the hilt, and you'll see these this completely opposite effect of what is popular in women's clothes from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the 1900s. So, as you guys can see in these pictures here, you'll see the cage. There are two cages in here. We'll see an accentuation of ladies' assets, as we'll call them. So in the rear area and up top, you'll see an accentuation of those kinds of things. And you'll see the skirts will get smaller and smaller and smaller, and will eventually lose the cages altogether, and you'll just kind of have this rear end saddle that sits back there and kind of puffs up your bottom. But eventually that will be dropped too, especially in the early 1900s. Now, with this, I've got a couple cool things that I want to show you. So, here, this is called a stereo viewer. These are incredibly cool, and these were really popular about the late 1890s, early 1900s. This one was created in 1901, and it's actually patented June 11th, 1901 for this model. And what you'll have is you'll have these stereo viewer cards, which I have to find my stereo viewer cards. Here we go. And I don't know how well you guys can see these, but you've got these cards that have dual images. It's the same image on both sides. And I don't know how many of you guys remember 3D glasses from when you were a kid. You'll have a red side and a blue side, and you'll put your glasses on and you'll see two exact images, one just kind of put slightly over top of the other. This is essentially the same thing. And what you'll do is you'll place it inside this little holder right here. Put this down, and you've got two lenses in here. And these lenses will help create a 3D image. And so you can just kind of put this up to your face like this and move it back and forth to be able to create a 3D image, and you can pull it back and forth into focus and out of focus, and it will create a 3D image. These are made in the same way that modern screen printing is made. So, you know, you'll have basic color go down. Woo! And I'll throw it on the floor, evidently. but a basic color will go down, and then another basic color will go down, and then another basic color will go down until you have two exact images that have colors in them. Most of the early ones do not have colors in them at all. This one is from Roosevelt's inauguration, so it's a little different. It's not quite from this time period, but I've seen them from this time, and a lot of times they'll depict things like ships that have sunk, historical events in other ways, McKinley's funeral. I think actually all of these ones that I have out today are all from Roosevelt's inauguration, so that doesn't do me any good to show you any more of these. But you'll also see the development of plastics. And I've got a couple other things to show you here. Some really cool primary source documents. Now, this is an old dressing table set, and I don't know how well you guys can see this. But from as early as we humans have been brushing our hair, you'll see hairbrushes that look like this. And you'll see very elaborate hairstyles up until the point where shampoo becomes a thing. And what this does is these are very soft bristles. These soft bristles aren't meant to get knots out of your hair. That's what things like this comb are for. This comb is made out of something called French ivory, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And what they'll do is they'll take these brushes and they'll brush the oils down their hair so that it will appear clean, it won't appear greasy, but you can still get these really elaborate hairstyles out of this. So women, those of you guys who are girls in my class, think about if you ever went to prom, if you ever got married, what do the hairdressers always tell you before you get your hair done? Don't wash it. Why? Because the oil helps keep it in place, right? Same concept, really elaborate hairstyles, but most of it is based on the fact that they can keep these oils in their hair because they don't have anything that can really hold their hair into these shapes except bobby pins. There's no hairspray at this time. You have things that'll kind of get rid of some of the greasiness, and you'll have things that will, prevent head lice and things like that, but you won't have hairspray. You won't have hair gel. You can also see nail buffs, like this. You've got pieces to help get your buttons into your shoes. You can't really see ladies' shoes in these pictures that I've got on here, but this is a button hook, and what you'll do is you'll shove this through the buttonhole in your shoe. You'll grab your button, and then you'll pull your button through because your buttons are so small and your buttonhole's so tight because shoelaces are not really a thing at this point. You can pull those through with this, and this is the only way to get it. And you can see kind of the geometric patterns that are going on at this time, and this is really iconic for the time. We're starting to see a movement into Art Deco and Art Nouveau and all of those things that people associate with modernity, and with the early 1900s with flappers. We're starting to see the beginnings of this, and in Victoria and England, these patterns are starting to become popular. They're not quite super popular yet, but they're getting there. And with these, like I said, they're made out of French ivory, and so we're starting to develop plastics. Now, with plastics, up to this point, before this Industrial Revolution, people used what they called natural plastics in order to make goods. So for things like piano keys, combs and brushes, they would use ivory generally. But ivory is becoming harder to get. So they're having to develop new things to make their goods out of. So this, for example, is a new kind of plastic, and this is made out of the same kind of material that film is made out of. And they call it French ivory because it ends up looking like ivory a little bit, but it's actually plastic. So it becomes very, very popular during this time. It's called celluloid. People start making jewelry out of it, buttons out of it, anything you could possibly imagine that might be associated with natural ivy will really come into use for these kinds of pieces. And all of these are made out of the same thing. You'll see pillboxes, and you'll see little tubes for goods. Things like that will, become really, really popular. Jewelry cases, ink pen holders, things like that. We've got an old nail file here, which is very cool. And then I've got just a few more things to show you, and then we'll move on to the last slide, and we'll be done for the evening. Whoops! These old dressing table sets are really cool. Okay. Now, the last thing I have to show you are some of the things that we're seeing for workers. So, this here is part of a pamphlet or insurance given to railroadmen for the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen. And essentially this is just a document that says that if you die or you get hurt under the bylaws of the Brotherhood, you will have a beneficiary who will receive a sum for the case of your death. Or incapacitation or what have you. And, you can see there are transfer informations on here. It has to be sealed. You're seeing gold leaf. This one is from, let me see, I think this is 1907. I'm sorry, 1909. So we're starting to see the idea of insurance and things about people being compensated for injuries starting to come up at this point. Compensation for workers and protections for workers, things like that coming up. And you'll also have these, the development of modern pictures. This will come about at this time. Now, there is a type of film prior to this that will be used most often in the Civil War and most often in the times following the Civil War and leading up to the Civil War. But around 1900 we'll start seeing these kinds of modern pictures on modern paper come about. I'm actually going to show you one of the older types of camera development pictures, those kinds of things. But you'll have to give me a minute on that one. You've also got these kinds of paper documents that show participation in various groups that are known for protections for various things. So this one is the Masonic Lodge. It's a subscription form. You'll start seeing a lot of these starting to float around. This other one here was the Independent Order of the Odd Fellows, the official certificate. So you'll start seeing these kinds of associations really popping up. Now, while I'm thinking of it, I'm going to go get that other camera type. And in lieu of me having to try to pause this and get this re-going because I'm not very tech savvy, I'm just going to run and get it. It'll take me about 10 seconds. I'll be right back. Okay, guys, now that I am back with you, I will show you an older camera form for pictures. Now, these pictures are in these kinds of little boxes a lot of times. And if you open up these boxes, we'll have these lovely felt interiors with these really pretty designs and these little plates inside. And with these plates, come on, little guy. Well, actually, you're a lady. I shouldn't call you a little guy. You'll see little glass plates, and if you look at the back of them, they kind of have the quality of like film that's not been developed yet. But what this is this is called a daguerreotype, and this image is burnt directly onto a piece of glass. It takes a couple hours to process. And with this, it has an incredibly slow exposure. So the only way to get this kind of picture is either to have someone sit for long periods of time, which is why a lot of times people in these older pictures, they look kind of sour-faced. It's because they have to sit for very, very long periods of time. And they can't move their faces because if they move their faces, they'll blur the picture. So they could do that, or you can have a bright flash and it will capture that image and develop it within the camera that way. And you can see here, this is the company of the daguerreotype, the photographic company. And this one's called Holmes, Booth, and Hayden's Daguerreotype Photographic and Ambrotype Goods of every description. So you've got these little boxes and a little piece of glass with an image burned onto it, and a little pretty covering. And it just sits down in here. And this is all padded to protect the piece of glass from breaking and falling apart. So, kind of neat stuff I just wanted to show off to you guys. These are really undervalued, in my opinion, primary sources. But you've also got clothing. You've got documents from this time. You've got newspapers that are coming into abundance. I mean, abundance of newspapers. Newspapers are generally a historian's best friend, just from the fact that, especially during this time period, because they've got so much information in them. So let's move on from popular culture and go on to the last thing that we need to discuss, and this is suffrage. The women's suffrage movement, it will really come into play more in the early 20th century than it will the late 19th century. So you have really popular figures in the suffrage movement, and suffrage just means the right to vote. You can have anyone at any age attempt to gain suffrage. They don't have to be women, they don't have to be men, they don't have to be African American. It's just the right to vote. That's suffrage. So Laura Clay is one of the most prominent suffragists. She's the daughter of Marcus Cassius Clay, who is the guy with the big Bowie knife. She will be the co-founder and first president of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association, a leader in the American women's suffrage movement. She'll be active in the Democratic Party on all levels and be the first woman to be nominated for the presidency at a convention of a major political party. She'll lobby for legislative reforms like protecting women's wages and property. There will be a thought within major companies that if women get married, their income should drop because they'll have a husband to compensate for their income. So, they will lose money in their wages because they get married. Within state women's mental hospitals, she'll lobby for female doctors to be on the premises to treat female patients. She'll lobby for female students to be able to enter into Kentucky universities. She'll lobby for the first female dorms at Kentucky universities. She'll increase the age of female marriage consent, which some of you guys might not think is a big deal, but for those who are wanting to be more educated and who are wanting to really find their place, if they enter into marriage, that kind of ends for them. So she's attempting to increase the age of female marriage consent so that people can wait before they have children and before they have all of these obligations. She will attempt to create juvenile courts, which she succeeds at. And she'll be active in the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Along with her are some very prominent members of the suffrage movement. You've got Susan B. Anthony, who almost everyone knows, and she'll be part of the women's rights movement, and she'll be part of a greater social reform movement. She was formerly an abolitionist, and she's committed to social equality on all standings. So the poor get included, African Americans get included, women get included, everyone should be included in this social equality. And when they create the 14th Amendment to the United States, or excuse me, the 19th Amendment, and it'll be fashioned after the 14th Amendment. It'll be called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and it will happen in 1920. And it will be backed by California Republican Senator Aaron Sargent. But it will kind of have some basic issues with it because it's fashioned after the 14th Amendment. It'll fail the first go around because this argument kind of stems back to the idea that if men have the right to vote, then women will have the right to vote based on, the same wording within this. So, they'll try under Minor and Happersett to argue that women have the right to vote based on the 14th Amendment. It'll fail completely. And so they'll have to fashion a new amendment based off the 14th Amendment in order to gain the right to vote, which will be called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment or the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. I hope that was clear because I know that maybe it sounded a little convoluted. All you need to know is that the Susan B. Anthony Amendment will become the 19th Amendment, which will give women the right to vote. And it's supported by Senator Aaron Sargent. Okay, so Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She is part of the temperance movement, which is the movement to limit alcohol, which will eventually lead to prohibition. She's an abolitionist. She is a friend of Susan B. Anthony's and will become a influential leader in the women's civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, with Susan B. Anthony. And she initiated the movement for women's rights with her Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls at a convention in New York. She would not support the 14th Amendment on the basis that it lacked a clause giving women's rights. But she will still support African Americans in them being freed from slavery. So she's kind of one of these figures who tends to straddle the fence. And you'll see a lot of figures at this time who kind of can't sit very easily on one side of politics or the other. It's a fact of the times. But you guys saw how convoluted politics were in this time in the last slide. They're no less convoluted now. So with the 19th Amendment, it will state the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So, that being said, that is the end of tonight's lesson. I hope you guys enjoyed that, especially my little show and tell. If you ask me, these are some of the best parts of history, is getting to have hands-on feeling for some of these historical pieces. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I will see you guys next week. So have a good week. Thank you, and have a good night.